there, you're listening to the Estranged Heart podcast, and I'm your host, Kreed Revere. Welcome back to our returning listeners, and if this is your first time here, thank you for selecting this podcast to listen to. As we begin today's episode, I invite you to grab a cup of coffee or tea, settle in, and listen with an open heart. But first, the disclaimer: I am not a licensed therapist or counselor. Nothing within this podcast should be considered or taken as therapy. If you are in need of therapeutic support such as counseling, please seek out a therapist near you. A couple of announcements and reminders. I am still asking for the submission of questions you have as an estranged parent or an estranged adult child that you would like me to answer on the podcast. And to be able to do that, I need you to submit those questions to me. You may do that via direct message through Instagram at The Estranged Heart or via email. And my email address is theestrangedheart@gmail.com. Again, you may do this via direct message through Instagram or my email address, which is theestrangedheart@gmail.com. Whatever questions you have, I want this podcast to be purposeful, and in a way of doing that is to make sure that my listeners are getting answers to their questions, and estrangement certainly is a breeding ground for all sorts of questions. So please feel free to send those to me, and I will be happy to answer them to the best of my ability. And an announcement: if you would like to support this podcast and the work that I do in the estrangement world and estrangement and reconciliation world, I would like to invite you to consider a financial donation. I spend approximately 10 hours every week creating content, researching resources and information, editing and producing each episode to include bonus episodes. I facilitate an online support group, and I respond every day, every week, to inquiries from both estranged parents and adult children. Take that and combine that with my full-time day job, and that leaves Kreed a very tired girl. Your donation would help me to be able to hire out some of the parts that are required to produce a podcast, such as editing and researching content. Those are very time-consuming, and I didn't realize how time-consuming they would be until I got into producing a podcast. So it would also, a financial contribution would also allow me to be available to help support more parents and adult children in their estrangement and reconciliation journeys. And that is ultimately my end goal here, is to be able to help bring families back together. And in order to do that, I need time and space available to give that to others. So with that being said, if you would like to become a supporter of the Estranged Heart in a financial way, you may do so for as little as 99 cents per month. And there are two different options. One is via Patreon, my Patreon community, or directly through this podcast platform on anchor.fm. And I will leave the information regarding these options in the show notes for those who may be interested. So let's get into today's episode, which is titled Doormat versus Boundaries. Being a doormat is not required to heal and reconcile. A couple of sayings and quotes first. You either walk inside your story and own it, or you stand outside your story and hustle for your worthiness. Brene Brown. Sometimes fighting together feels less painful than hurting alone. Also, Brene Brown. And a final one by Brene Brown. The problem is when we stop caring what people think and stop feeling hurt by cruelty, we lose our ability to connect. But when we are defined by what people think, we lose the courage to be vulnerable. Therefore, we need to be selective about the feedback we let into our lives. For me, it's not in the arena. If you're not in the arena, also getting your ass kicked, I'm not interested in your feedback. So for today, one of the questions that I get so often, and that I read about, and that I hear stories about, and generally they're coming from the parents, is, I guess I just have to be a doormat in order to have my kids in my life. And then from the adult children, I hear, I've placed boundaries and they keep crossing them, and therefore I can't have them in my life. And so I think that one of the things that's happening is that sometimes, not every time, but sometimes we're getting our wires crossed when it comes to perhaps what the intention is versus what one is feeling, right? And because of that, I think that this is where we can, one person is feeling like they have to be a doormat when the other person is saying, I'm simply placing boundaries and I'm no longer allowing you to do what you've been doing in my life. And so those are how we interpret things, and our perception of things can be very different based off of our own history and our own lived histories. So as we get started today, I want to offer this for both. This episode is for both estranged parents and estranged adult children. And I will speak to both of you individually throughout this episode. But for both of you, I want to start with addressing everyone. The first thing is to remember, hurt people hurt people. And I by no means am I trying to simplify estrangement or the pain that comes with estrangement. That's not what I'm doing. But I do think it's important to understand that, let's use a metaphor. If you have a wounded animal, right? And that could be a wild animal or a domestic animal. I've seen dogs, I've experienced myself, my own dogs, who have been in pain, who have snipped at me, right? At no other time did they do that, but when they were hurting. Okay, so I think it's just, let's kind of bring some things into context, right? It helps us to, again, take out the charge and the intensity of our emotions. So hurt people hurt people. The second thing is again, to understand the importance of language. What one person, the definition that one person assigns to a word or to a phrase is interpreted differently by someone else. And I know that I hear often from parents, you can't change the definition of a word. I'm not saying I'm changing the definition. I'm saying that the perception and what someone is perceiving changes, as well as with time and over the decades, things do take on different meanings and different definitions. And I think if we're not staying on top of that, we can misconstrue one generation can misconstrue what another generation is trying to say, and vice versa. The third thing is, I think it's important to remember that what works for one may not work for another. So If you're a parent, what worked with one estranged adult child may not work for the other, right? Even though they were raised in the same house, I hear this often, they were raised in the same house with the same parents. We did the exact same thing for everyone. And one of the things that I'm putting out there for consideration is that your children are not the same. And so what worked for one isn't going to work for another. What hurt one may not hurt the other. So important to keep that in mind. And for adult children, what works for one parent may not work for the other parent. So one parent may agree with you and the other parent may not, right? They're different people, even though they raised you, some of you, together, okay? The fourth thing is feelings and intent. I mentioned this just a little bit earlier. These are two very different things. And I think it's important to recognize they're not the same, right? How someone feels about something and what someone intended are two very different things. And the final piece to this, the fifth thing, is boundaries are hard when one is feeling flooded with emotions. And when I say boundaries are hard, it can be really difficult to adhere to boundaries when we are emotionally flooded. Oftentimes we can't discern. Our discernment and judgment is off because we're just absolutely flooded and overcome with emotions. And I tend to see this more often with, an adult child saying, I've told you, I put these boundaries in place, and the parent is in a place in the middle of their estrangement where they're just flooded with emotions on a daily basis and they don't know what to do with that, or they don't have an outlet. And when I say an outlet, a constructive and healthy outlet to be able to process all of their emotions. And so it's just a swirl within themselves that they can't get out of. And so when they are in that, they're not going to be able to oftentimes adhere to any boundaries that you place. And for parents, when you disregard boundaries for your children that they've asked for and they become flooded with emotions, then that causes the outburst and the lashing out and the quote unquote bad behaviors, right? So just something else to keep in mind. So for parents, one thing that I want you to consider is, again, the meaning of words and the requests that your children have. When your adult children are asking or demanding that you work on yourself, that is not them treating you like a doormat. That is not them disrespecting you. Maybe the way in which it is presented to you might be disrespectful. If they're yelling and screaming at the top of their lungs and shouting profanities at you, that's disrespectful. But them asking or even demanding that you work on yourself before they will have contact with you, that's not them treating you like a doormat. Okay? Just because they are your children, they do not get a free pass to spew profanities at you if that is something that you do not like. And I will tell you, just from my own personal experience, profanities are not something that bothers me. I worked in a career field for many, many years, well over a decade, where profanities were just a part of the everyday language. And so profanities do not bother me. I do recognize they are very bothersome to other folks, and particularly the older generations. They do consider that a sign of disrespect, and I will tell you that your younger generations do not. And so therein lies one issue, right? Because one generation finds it disrespectful and the other generation is like, this is my everyday language, and if you don't like it, get over it. So, however, if you have asked them in a kind way, in a firm but kind way, to not spew profanities at you, and they continue to do so, that you do not have to tolerate that, right? You don't. You get that choice. They don't get a free pass to physically harm you. If they're laying hands on you without your permission, not cool. And they don't get a free pass to do that. I don't generally hear about things like that unless the adult child, there's some sort of mental illness or drug and alcohol substance abuse. Sometimes I'll hear about that through that, but outside of those two things, I don't generally hear about physically harming, parents being physically harmed. They don't get a free pass to steal from you, to take things that are not theirs. They just don't. Just because they're your child does not mean they get a free pass to do that. They don't get a free pass to demand all of your time and energy and everything to be done for them when they say, and you are supposed to ask, when they say jump, you ask how high. That's not a healthy relationship, and they don't get a free pass to do that. And again, one of the key things in doing that, in responding to them, is to not elevate yourself or lower yourself to their level, right? If they're spewing profanities at you and they're screaming at the top of their lungs, you screaming at the top of your lungs and spewing profanities at them and spewing demands at them, no one's going to get anywhere. It's just not. It's going to be nothing but a disastrous event. Someone has to disengage. And generally, that's the parent that needs to disengage. They don't get a free pass to guilt you into doing something by withholding access to your grandchildren or otherwise use children as a weapon to get what they want. That's not cool. And we see some of that in estrangement, although I will say that most times when the grandchildren are withheld, it is because of a belief that the estranged adult child has in the fact that they don't want their children harmed. And by harmed, again, we're talking about the difference in generations and definitions. The older generation says, I have not harmed my children, and I certainly would not harm my grandchildren. And they think that that's because they would not physically harm them. And most times, the adult children are viewing the harm as emotional harm and not physical harm. And so it's important to recognize that. That being said, they don't get to, give you you could see the grandkids if I get this or I get that, or you can't see the grandkids if you don't do this for me or do that for me. That's not cool. That's using children. Okay? And so that's, again, not a free pass. And they don't get a free pass to demand financial support. If you don't give me X number of dollars, then I'm not going to ever see you again. If you don't pay for this or pay for my house or my mortgage or buy me a home or buy me a new car, then I'm just leaving and you'll never see or hear from me again. They can do these things and they can say those things, but demanding those things from a parent is not, it's not cool, and it is treating them like a doormat. It's using you as a parent, and that is not acceptable. That's not cool. One of the things that I want to get clear in this episode is I hear sometimes from estranged parents that I am an advocate for allowing kids to, quote unquote, as the last one I got was, quote, you're an advocate of having these kids just shit all over us, end quote. And that is so far from the truth. I am in no way telling an estranged parent to accept abuse and blatant disrespect and harm just to have a relationship with their adult children. I am not advocating for that. That is absolutely false. Okay? So, I just want to get that cleared. You have a right as a parent to place boundaries. We often hear that our adult children have placed boundaries, and oftentimes I hear parents that are confused by that. They don't understand exactly what the adult child is trying to get across when they talk about boundaries, because it's just not something that the older generation did with their own parents, right? And so it's a concept that's not truly understood, I feel like, by the older generation. And so they, don't quite understand that. But what I want you to know as a parent, you also have the right to place boundaries, right? And what does that look like? A boundary could be, I love you, Billy. You may not speak to me like that. If you continue to do so, I will leave. That's a boundary, right? You continue to talk to me this way, and I am going to exit the conversation. Okay? Or you may not speak to me that way, and if you continue to do so, I need you to leave. That's a boundary. So things like that. And again, I'd like to say that how someone reacts and responds to our boundaries is not your responsibility. It is their responsibility. So if you've placed a boundary and they start kicking and screaming and crying and carrying on, spewing profanities at you and things like that, that does not mean that you disregard the boundary. That does not mean that you have placed a wrong boundary. That does not mean that you shouldn't have placed the boundary. That's not what that means. That means that how they are responding and reacting to you placing a boundary is their issue, not yours. It's not. And if you place a boundary and they remove themselves from your life or continued the removal and distance, that is their option. Just like it is your option to respond or react to their boundaries. And I think that we get that. That is something that no one has taught us, especially the older generation. And I can say, even my age, and I know that I recognize that I'm younger than many estranged parents. But that's why I kind of sit in between both, not just from my own experience as a formerly estranged mom and formerly estranged adult daughter, but just because of my age, I cross between both of them. So anyway, you have those rights to place boundaries. You do not have to tolerate misbehavior and abuse. And when I say misbehavior, I'm asking you to consider that it's something beyond just something you don't like, right? You can not like the way your child behaves or responds or the choices they make in their life. That's not them treating you like a doormat. That is not them treating you like shit. Okay? You gotta figure out a way to place the boundaries and understand that their reaction to that is up to them. And you must keep on keeping on with your life, right? You are deserving of respect as a human being. And this is going to be a topic for another episode in the future. But this idea of what do we owe our parents is something I think that has, for me personally, owing someone something does not set well with me. And I think that it doesn't set well with most estranged adult children. I want to be able to give and have a relationship with my parents because I feel loved and I feel belonging and I feel connected with them, not because I owe them connection. And it's the same thing for my adult children. I don't want them to feel that they owe me anything. I want the connection with them because they want it. And I know that there's a difference in generations and, just the structure of the family and the dynamics of the family. It's very different today than it was in 1950, 1960, 1970, 1980. It's very different today. So, okay, on to adult children. I want you to know that even though your parents loved you, it does not mean that they had the tools to effectively honor your feelings, right? And even though your parents, quote, did the best they could with the information they had at the time, that does not mean that they did not cause you pain or that they are entitled to continue on with hurting you. Okay? It's a way of understanding why they may have done the things they said or did or didn't do the things they should have said and done. But it doesn't give them, as we talked about with you guys and the parents, it doesn't give them a free pass to continue that behavior. When you become an adult and you've said, this hurt me and you're no longer allowed to do this to me. Okay? Just because they are your parent, they do not get a free pass to place demands on you regarding where you live, where you work, who you marry, who you see, who you date, how you raise your children, all of those things. They don't get a free pass to that just because they're your parent. Okay? Would you give your neighbor a free pass to do that? No. They don't get a free pass either. They don't get a free pass to disrespect your spouse by, say, ignoring them because they don't like them, or otherwise pretend that they're not a part of your life. They don't get a free pass to do that just because they're your parent. They don't get a free pass to continue to hold financial support leverage against you. Oh, well, we've been paying for your mortgage for X number of years, and if you want us to continue to do that, you'll do such and such and such and such. Nope. No. They don't get a free pass to do that. They don't get a free pass to guilt you into being a part of their life. And this happens often, especially with mothers, where mom will say, but if you're not a part of my life, I can't continue on living. That is putting a guilt trip on you. You are not responsible for their life. You are not responsible for their happiness. You can be a part of that, but their life should not begin and end with you. You should be a part of their life, okay? So they don't get a right to guilt you into being a part of their life. And you have a right to place boundaries as well. Most of you know that. Most estranged adult children who have estranged have placed boundaries, and those boundaries have been disrespected or not followed, not honored, and as such, you've cut off contact, right? For those of you who have not placed boundaries and you've just gone silent, I would like to help you to see the value in letting your parent know what your boundaries are, because that is empowering you, and I would like to empower you to do that. Okay. What might that look like? You could say something like, Mom, please do not talk down to me. I am deserving of respect if for no other reason than I am a human being. Or, I love you, Mom. You may not tell me where we should or should not be living. If you continue to do so, I will be forced to limit our contact. Those are healthy boundaries. And it's important to recognize and realize that in placing those boundaries and in stating those boundaries, their delivery and presentation speaks volumes, right? If you're yelling and screaming at your parent, they're less likely to hear you than if you remain calm and very matter of fact about what your boundaries are. And again, how they respond and react to you placing boundaries is not your responsibility, it's theirs. Okay? You are not responsible for how they react or respond, just like they are not responsible for how you react or respond to their boundaries. Okay? So, what do we do when we're trying to place boundaries, trying to empower ourselves, but either if you're a parent or an adult child? What do you do? Here are a few things that I listed out. First, understand that your needs are important. Okay? We all have needs, and those needs are important. But our needs cannot be contingent on what someone else does. We either need it or we don't. And if we need something, if you're saying, I need my child to be in my life, yes, that's a need. Maybe. Is it that you need them to be in your life? Or is it that you are needing connection and feeling a sense of value and purpose in the world? Because that can be found in other ways. That's just food for thought. We can talk about that in another episode in the future. Another thing that you can do is seek out people who value you for you. Again, for both the parent and the child. You seek out people who value you, who want to be around you and, appreciate you for who you are. This one is key. The third one, be firm but kind, right? In placing boundaries. I cannot stress this enough, right? This is typically where things go off the rails, is when the delivery is, loud and harmful and demeaning and all of those negative things. You can be firm and you can be kind in the delivery of those boundaries. Keep your expectations realistic, right? Don't expect something that is just totally outside of the box for someone to do. Okay? Be willing to put some distance for a time between you, right? It gives people time to chill out, for the flames to die down a little bit, right? For people to kind of be able to reevaluate and look at things differently. Sometimes time and distance is needed for that. Keep in mind, you are in charge of what you do, not what they do. Again, I said it twice before in this episode. You are not responsible for how another person reacts or responds to your boundaries. Okay? Be direct. Don't pussyfoot around. Don't try to paint it a pretty picture. Don't, and don't be like in your face, mean about it, but be direct. You may not speak to me in that tone. You may not say those words to me. You may not shove me into the wall. You may not just be very direct in what you're asking and what the boundaries are. And seek to take care of yourself and learn to be assertive, right? Especially for moms, it's really hard. Women in general, daughters too, right? Daughters and moms, women in general, it's hard to be assertive if that's not something you were taught young. And women tend to struggle with that more than men. And so I'm asking you to learn how to do that and learn to be assertive, to be direct, to be firm, but also to be kind. Okay? I hope that has helped you to kind of gather a little bit. I mean, I could talk for hours on this subject and get into the nitty gritty of it. But I think the biggest takeaway is to remember the difference in language, right? To understand that one person's interpretation of what it means to be a doormat is someone else's interpretation of a boundary. And if you can kind of keep that in mind and delve a little bit more into what could this person potentially be meaning by saying this, where I took it as they're treating me like I'm a doormat, but are they really doing that, or is that my interpretation of it based off of my own life experiences and how others have talked to me, or what is the versus their intent? So I think that is the big takeaway from today, and I hope that this is helped in some way to get clear on that. So this brings this episode to a close. I hope that this time together was time you feel well spent, and that you are able to find some takeaway nuggets to help you on your journey, wherever you may be on your estrangement and reconciliation path. If you feel that you have received something helpful or positive from this podcast, please consider following us, sharing the podcast with others, and perhaps leaving us a positive review. You can also follow us on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok under the same name, The Estranged Heart. And as a reminder, I do have an online support group on Facebook. If you search Estranged Mothers Support Group, that should come up. And most folks in that support group, it is for moms who consider themselves spiritual. They approach estrangement with a sense of curiosity rather than blame and judgment, and they desire to do inner self-work and reflection. And lastly, if you are an estranged parent or estranged adult child and would like to have your story shared on the podcast, anonymously or not, please reach out via email at theestrangedheart@gmail.com. Again, theestrangedheart@gmail.com. And alternately, you can visit the website and reach me there as well. And the website is www.theestrangedheart.com. Until next time.